Hi, this is Paul Christopher Hoppy, aka Giant Buddha from pokersaskill.com. This is Hand of the Day number 2, the inaugural episode of our Limit Hold'em section of the series. So, I'll be flipping back and forth from game to game depending on what hands come up, what seems interesting. This hand was actually submitted by someone on Twitter, so feel free to send me a message about a hand you have a question about. It's at pokersaskill on Twitter. So go ahead and follow us there, and you can send a PM or get in touch with me there, and maybe we'll take a look at one of your hands on these videos. Anyway, this was a $1, $2 hand of Heads Up Limit Hold'em, and while Heads Up Limit Hold'em isn't the most common variety, the lessons in this hand they're pretty fundamental, and they also apply to 6-max and full ring play just as much as they do Heads Up Limit Hold'em. So we'll get right into that. So here we see our hero has ace-8 of diamonds in the big blind, and the small blind is going to open raise because it wouldn't be much of a hand if the small blind just folded. And so this situation is not so dissimilar to a button opening in a 6-max game or in a full ring game. It's pretty similar in that we have an assumption that this player is probably bad. Otherwise, we really should not be playing them at $1, $2 fixed limit hold'em. That would be a pretty big mistake because the rake's just going to be so high that you can really only get away with playing opponents that have pretty significant leaks. So among those would usually be open limping the button or folding a lot of buttons. So if this player was raising more than, say, 50 or 60% of their buttons, I would say you'd want to find a better spot. You'd probably be losing money even if this player was losing more, just because the rake's so high. So with that said, we're going to say that the button doesn't have more than a 50 or 60% range here. Now, given that, there are plenty of players in 6-max who can have a range easily that wide, and this player might even have a tighter range than that, in which case there's plenty of buttons or even cutoffs or players opening from any position that might have a range similar to this player's opening range. And in terms of pot odds, while there's no dead small blind in here like there would be in a ring game with 3 or more players, the rake is going to be smaller here. It's generally 50 cents in a heads-up game, or it caps at 50 cents, whereas it'll cap at $1, $2, $3, whatever in a full game. So that small blind frequently just gets raked away. So we can basically take anything we learn in this hand and apply it to a ring game. Now, in general, with a hand as strong as ace-8 of diamonds, I'd rather 3-bet here for a few reasons. I mean, number one, we'd probably have value against our opponent's range. We're probably doing better than 50% equity, so that's always good. That's generally a decent reason to 3-bet. Even if this player has, say, a 10, 20, 30% opening range on the button, that doesn't mean that it's top 10, 20, or 30%. We're assuming that this is a weaker player, so they can often limp with some strong hands, so they don't have all of those in their raising range, and then they can just have some really bizarre hands that they choose to raise with. When you see their percentage, it's not so much how big their range is as much as it is. I'm sorry, it's. No, that's accurate. It's not what percentage of different hands they raise with, like it would be with a good player typically. It's just roughly how often they feel like raising. So that's you want to interpret stats a little differently that way when you're up against a weaker player. Now, the hero does choose to just call here. I don't think that's horrible. I like to keep some ace highs in my range. I might call with a hand as strong as ace-8 offsuit, ace-9 offsuit, sometimes even ace-10 offsuit. You're not necessarily going to get a lot of better hands to fold post-flop, so you're not really generating folding equity. But the hand is often a little easier to play when you do 3-bet it. So, here, anyway, he just calls. That's probably okay. I'm not going to say that that's super bad or anything. The flop comes out and he flops the nut draw, nut flush draw with a couple of weak backdoor straight draws and, a decent ace high, so 2 overs to middle pair also. So that's a strong hand. You know, if I had just called this pre-flop, I would be thinking about just check calling down for value, just letting the opponent bluff off. If it was the sort of player that would that would bet very aggressively and would call not all the way down with, say, king high, queen high. One thing here is that check raising is done for value. When you're check raising here, this is not a semi bluff, right? So the big blind is check raising, which I'm fine with. Again, while check calling is a legitimate option for just getting to showdown, and early on in a heads up encounter, I might be inclined to take that just so I could get a little more information on my opponent, and then they might start thinking that I'm just going to be check calling my ace high flush draws when in fact sometimes I'm going to be check raising them for value, because again, our hand is strong on this board. We have 15 outs to beat any pair smaller than a 9, and we also have ace high, which is good a lot of the time. So that's good. Our equity is going to be looking good. It was good before the flop. It's good on the flop. So we could have 3-bet pre. We could check raise here. Either way is fine. The main thing is that when you 3-bet pre-flop, post-flop is sometimes going to be a little easier to play. When you check raise this board, it's possibly going to be a little harder to play. I would very often be planning to bet all the way to showdown depending on how the board came out. Now, I actually haven't played very much 1-2 heads up because the rake's so bad, and just generally play higher than that. But I imagine it's actually pretty tough to beat the rake. You need to have a very large edge on your opponents when you're paying 4 or 5 on some sites, maybe even 6 big bets per 100 in rake. So, but the check raise is fine, and the question really comes here on the turn where the king comes off, and so. The player who played this hand and asked me about it was asking, what should I do on this turn after check raising the flop? And yeah, that's one thing about check raising the flop, and one thing about 3-betting or not 3-betting pre-flop is it's important to kind of have an idea. Okay, if I'm check raising this flop, why am I check raising it? And what sorts of turns am I going to barrel? What sorts of turns aren't I? When the king comes off, you might say, oh, well, maybe now I can get some ace highs to fold. Maybe I can get some, small pairs to fold. I don't really see that. I mean, against a really terrible player, maybe they will do that, although you tend to think those sorts of players will go to showdown very liberally. So here, with the king, it's not really a scare card if your opponent's paying any attention. All of the hands, it's not a diamond, so it didn't improve flush draws. It didn't improve a hand like ace 3, ace 4, 3 4, 3 6, 4 6, 6 7, 6 8, 7 8. All of those straight draws. It missed all of the straight draws. And why are you going to have a king here? I mean, when would you have a king? King 2? King 5, maybe? If you have a hand like king queen, king jack, you're probably just going to be check calling and maybe even taking it to showdown that way. So, this card, there's no real reason for your opponent to think it hits you. Now, against more aggressive opponents, I might be inclined to bet call this turn and then check call the river, provided nothing really awful came off on the river. Although I don't think there's just so many draws that they can't all get there, right? There's as many gaps in this board as possible. So basically anything could be a draw almost. So any card could come and there could still be a ton of draws that don't get there. So, looking at that, what are we going to do? I would bet call down against an aggressive opponent, but this player, is it an aggressive opponent? I don't know, and that's the thing, is that we don't have a read, and so that's really kind of the most important thing in situations like this. So if we think he has a pretty wide range, then there's no reason to really think that this king hit him that hard. So we can just keep betting, and if we get raised, we can call it down. Or if we think that this is a pretty honest, straight up player, then we can bet call the turn, and we can check fold the river unimproved. Just if we think there's just not the sort to really semi bluff that much on the turn, and that's maybe a fine line at 1-2, and by fine I mean it's okay, as opposed to a fine narrow line. Although it's sort of that as well, knowing whether you can take this to showdown or not. Against a very unobservant player who's not going to do something like raising the king, who's not going to realize that it doesn't really hit our range, and then it hits his range a little harder than ours. You might want to just check call. You might just say, okay, well, the king came off. I'm just going to check, let him bluff it, and just get to showdown that way. The thing is there are a lot of cards like this king. There's a 10, there's a jack, there's a queen, there's a king. All of those cards are overcards that should be equally scary to us, really. So 4 of those are going to be diamonds, but that's 12 overcards. So that's going to be a lot of checking on the turn, and I think our hand kind of looks, actually not even so much just like what it is, as much as it looks a little stronger. It almost looks like we have a 5 or a 2 or even a weak 9, and we got scared of the king if we check here. So if we do check here against certain types, you can check call and then even check fold the river, because your hand just looks it looks like a hand that you want to get to showdown with, that they're not going to think they can bluff you off of. So this is just in that that delicate category of hands where you have a hand with marginal showdown value, but also very strong equity on the flop especially, and then strong equity still on the turn. But your equity drops substantially from the flop to the turn. So on the flop you would have been check raising for value, whereas on the turn you're kind of in that nether region. I'm not sure that's exactly the phrase I'm looking for. Anyway, you're you're in that sort of world between worlds, I guess, where you don't have clear value, you don't have a clear bluff because you can't really get a lot of hands to fold, and that's why you think about checking. But when you do check, you really make your hand very transparent to to good players. So I wouldn't really want to do that against good players very often. But everything that we know about this player, which unfortunately is very little, except that our hero has decided to play them at heads up limit hold'em at $1, $2. So we're going to assume that they're probably a bad player, and assuming that, we're gonna say, okay, let's I'd say probably check all the turn and then sort of make a decision on the river. If the board pairs, I'd feel better about calling. Actually, I might even feel better about calling. Well, if it pairs, then our kicker. If a king or a 9 comes, then our kicker plays, whereas if a 2 or a 5 comes, it doesn't. So we'd kind of like it to play just in case they're doing something weird with ace 3, ace 4, ace 6, ace 7. But so I guess that's not really clear advice. This is how you should play this sort of hand. There isn't a general answer for that. Is really the problem. It depends entirely on your opponent's tendencies as far as what hands will they take to showdown. Will they bluff raise the turn? Will they bluff if you check to them? In my original written response to the player of this hand, I said that I would tend to bet this turn because I would get bluffed at more often than if I checked. And I think that's very likely against stronger players, or even moderately stronger players, or aggressive players that kind of have a little bit of sophistication where they're not going to, just sit there and think, oh, he checked, I bet. It's really a very sort of crude mentality that when someone check raises his flop and then checks his turn, oh, now I'm gonna bluff because he was just kidding. I don't think that's the majority of players, but it might be a lot of the players you face at 1-2. So hopefully that's the sort of player you're playing against, and you can take that line. But you really want to keep your eyes open for what sorts of hands your opponent raises a turn with. If he's raising here with a 5 or a 9 for value, then that makes bet calling down a little worse. If he's semi-bluffing with Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, hands that have some showdown value but you still beat, that makes betting trying to get bluff raised a little better. So, just pay attention to what your opponent's tendencies are. That's really the most important thing in any situation in poker. So this was Paul Christopher Hoppy, aka Giant Buddha, with Hand of the Day number 2. Leave your questions and comments on the website, pokersaskill.com, and thanks for watching.